What is a SQL view and why should I use it instead of a table? Let's jump right in. Before we get into that, let's cover some basics. What is a view? It's basically a database object, just like, your tables, your functions, your stored procedures, that kind of thing. It's basically a way to save a SQL statement within a database management system. So I get it. A view is a way to internally save a query, but what are some key attributes? For one, it doesn't actually store any data. Some people may suggest that it is a table, but that's definitely not true. A SQL view is nothing beyond just a SQL statement itself. It doesn't store any data or data structures, neither temporarily nor permanently. Another attribute is that the query is executed when you call that view. When you perform a select on the view, only then the underlying SQL will execute. From a database administration standpoint, you get a ton of security best practices using views. You're able to grant access to the view without having to grant access to the table itself. Also, you don't have to expose all the columns. For instance, if you have an employee table with sensitive data such as salaries, you can actually create a view to provide access to that table but exclude the salary column. So that way you're able to share the data without necessarily exposing the sensitive information. And then finally, with a view, you can't delete any data since it doesn't store any data. So it's very safe from that standpoint to use. You might get some interview questions such as, what is a view as opposed to a table? Or why should I use a view? And the different elements we've just covered are going to help you answer that. Quick pause, guys. If you made it this far, please do consider subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything, but it sure does help me out a ton. Thank you. A view is a good way to save your query to be able to reuse it in the future. You can have a SQL statement that's very complex or you use multiple joins. So being able to wrap that around in a view and be able to call it later on is just a lot easier to work with. It's a lot cleaner. So has a lot of different advantages from that standpoint. And then, of course, all the security features we mentioned, such as you don't have to expose all the columns. And then with a view, you can't really delete any data. And then finally, you can grant access to the view itself without having to grant access to the table. So how do I create a view? It's as simple as this. So if you have a table or if you have a SQL query written out, all you have to do is give the view a name. So something like create view, view name, and then as, and then you put your SQL statement down below. So in this example here, we have a table called emp, and the query itself would be select ID, name, manager ID from emp, and then I'm able to wrap that around as a view. So create view emp's public as, and then my SQL query. And then I'm able to reference this view later on by just querying my view. So now that we understand that, I'd like to dive into some practical examples of how we can use views to our advantage. So here's an example of when using a view might be helpful. So I have an employee table here, which consists of the employee ID, the name, and the manager ID. And it would be great for me to have a view that I could call, and that view is just going to give me the employee ID, the employee name, and the name of the manager instead of ID. So first we need to build our query. If we want to pull the name of the employee and the manager side by side, we're going to have to join to the same table using the manager ID as a foreign key and connect it to the primary key as ID. So let me show you what that looks like. So we're actually going to select the employee's ID, name, and then the manager's name. So m dot name, and I'm going to give this an alias of E because what we're going to do is we're going to join back to this table. So we're going to give the manager an alias of M, and again we're joining on the employee's manager ID equals the manager's ID. And this should give us the kind of output that we're looking for. The ID of the employee, the name of the employee, and then the name of the manager. Now to create my view, and I notice the name here is ambiguous, so I'll give this an alias of manager name. All I have to do really is give this a name. So create view employees with manager as, and then this is my query. So I'm actually going to plug this in right here as part of my schema. And now I can just reference this view instead of referencing my table. And if I do a select star, it'll give me the same output. So now I have a way to call a simple view instead of a table and get my ID name and the name of the manager. So here's an example of using a view just to be able to hide a certain column. We have the employee table here, and if I select everything from my table, this is the output I will get. So I have the ID, the name, the manager ID, and the salary, right? So let's say I want to be able to share this data set with someone, but not necessarily show the salary information because that is sensitive. So the way I could do that, first, how would I get to that output, right? So select ID name, manager ID from emp. So if I was to run this, I no longer see the salary. So what I could do is save this as a view. So create view and I don't know, employees public as what that query was. And I'll have to put it here and rebuild my schema. But now that I created this view and I'm only calling the ID name and manager fields, if I give this view to someone to be able to use, they're actually not going to be able to see the salary information, but they could still see everything else. So see, if you look here, you no longer see salary down here. Even so, if they were to type out salary, they wouldn't see it because that field is not part of the view. That field is not included as part of that view. So again, from a security standpoint, views are absolutely awesome to use. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys found it helpful. Be sure to subscribe.